Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our program this afternoon. My name is Jen Radine. I'm the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer here at Venable. I know we have our Venable colleagues on this call, and we also have some clients and maybe some other external attendees. So I want to welcome you and thank you for attending today. We're very excited about the panel that we have today. Before we get started and before I introduce our moderator, I just want to remind you that this is being recorded. Hopefully you heard that when you logged on. And also just to let you know that if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A throughout the program. We've allowed some extra time at the end of the program to answer any questions that you might have, but feel free to type them in as you think of them. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Colin Vandell, who's a partner at Venable and the chair of our LGBTQ group here at Venable. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen, and welcome everyone. It's nice to see you all today, and thanks for joining us. My name is Colin Vandell, and I'm a commercial litigation partner at Venable, and I'm based in the firm's Los Angeles office. I'm also the chair of LGBTQ at Venable, which is the firm's affinity group for LGBTQ attorneys and staff, along with allies. I'm very pleased that for our Pride Month event today, we have such a strong turnout of firm colleagues, clients, and friends. We're very fortunate to be joined by three accomplished scholars at the Williams Institute at UCLA Law School. The Institute is the preeminent organization in the world dedicated to the intersection of social science research, law, and public policy related to LGBTQ issues. The Institute has a distinct focus on facts and not on preordained findings or results. It is those factual findings that leads to far better laws and policies than persistent stereotypes that exist. Our three panelists are going to each introduce themselves and their work, but let me first tell you a little bit about who our three panelists are. First, Christy Mallory is the legal director of the Williams Institute and a Rinberg Senior Scholar. She focuses on state and local laws and policies that impact LGBTQ people, including sexual orientation and gender identity, non-discrimination protections, laws barring the use of gay and trans panic defenses, conversion therapy bans, and anti-bullying policies as well. Our next panelist is Luis Vasquez, who is the Arnold D. Casoy Scholar of Law at the Williams Institute. Luis's work includes a particular emphasis on issues related to LGBTQ-related discrimination, immigration, and housing, along with people of color and the LGBTQ community. And lastly today, Catherine Cohen joins us. Catherine is a scholar of law and policy, sexual and reproductive rights at the Williams Institute and the UCLA Center on Reproductive Health, Law, and Policy. She focuses her work on LGBTQ rights, gender and reproductive justice, and healthcare rights. Christy, Luis, and Catherine, we're thrilled to have you with us today to talk about the evolving legal landscape for the LGBTQ+ community. We have a lot to cover, including federal policy, state-level attacks on LGBTQ rights, and Supreme Court cases as well. Of course, with the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization decision set to be released shortly, with the expected overturning of Roe v. Wade, a particularly relevant topic of the moment is the implications of that decision, not only on reproductive rights, but also on LGBTQ rights. We will talk about those issues today, but first I'm hoping that we can go around and each of you can introduce yourselves and your work a bit more to those who are watching. Christy, would you be up for going first?
Of course. Thank you so much for that introduction, Colin. You described the Williams Institute, I think, better than I could have. So you're invited to all of our events. And thank you, everyone, for having us here today. We are so grateful for Venable's incredible support of the Williams Institute over the years. And I'm glad that we can come here today and tell you a little bit about what we're doing and share our research so you know what kind of work Venable has been supporting in this space, and very happy to be part of your Pride celebration this month. So as Colin said, I'm Christy Mallory. I'm the legal director at the Williams Institute. I have been at the Institute for almost 14 years now, so have lasted through several presidential administrations, as well as so many different iterations of state laws and policies that both protect LGBTQ people and increasingly seek to attack and harm LGBTQ people. So those are some of the issues that we're going to be discussing here today. Like Colin said, we are a research-focused organization. We're interdisciplinary, so our staff consists of lawyers and public health experts, psychologists, demographers, and folks who work across a spectrum of issues that impact LGBTQ people in a variety of different ways. And that's what really makes the Institute so unique and strong, is our ability to bring together all these different disciplines to inform laws and policies that affect LGBTQ people. So a large part of what we do is kind of tracks federal and state laws and policies, and ensure that we can inject our research into these debates, like Colin said, to ensure that these laws and policies are based on facts and not stereotypes. So we're here today to both talk a little bit about our work and to give you an idea of the lay of the land, what's happening with LGBTQ people right now, and what do we expect to have happen down the road in the next year, 5 years, 10 years.
Great. Thanks, Christy. Luis, you want to go next?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Colin. So first and foremost, I'd like to just quickly echo Christy's gratitude to the firm for this opportunity, both for your support generally, but also having the ability to be here to talk to you during Pride about these very important issues, as well as I'm sure you'll hear throughout the conversation about some of the research that we've been able to do to really inform our knowledge base about the lives, experiences, and disparities being faced by LGBTQ people. So my name is Luis Vasquez. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm one of the legal scholars here at the Williams Institute. I've been here for just a little under 3 years. I'm a graduate of UCLA School of Law. I first learned of the Williams Institute while I was actually working during my 1L summer for an organization called the Los Angeles HIV Law and Policy Project, which was started by a former Williams Institute scholar, and where I really learned about the ability to marshal research to not only impact the day-to-day lives of LGBTQ people, but also to use it to influence law and policy. At the time, a big project of ours that ended up being successful being to help lead efforts to decriminalize HIV here in the state of California. And so now as a Williams Institute scholar, I've had the ability to continue making sure, like Christy said, that debates are being informed by facts, by research, rather than by myths and stereotypes. And a large aspect of my work in particular has been to help us engage with federal agencies and the federal government more broadly, and ensuring that while they're considering laws, policies, regulations, guidance, and other movement and activity that impacts us in our day-to-day lives, that they're understanding the implications of our research, not only, again, on the lives and experiences of LGBTQ people, but even on matters on how do you measure someone's sexual orientation or gender identity when you're doing a federal survey? How do we get this information about LGBTQ people in the first place? And so I'm glad to always have those opportunities to share that research with the federal government and to really help make sure that we're moving the needle forward. And as you'll hear about in today's presentation, there certainly have been many opportunities for us to be able to do that. And again, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here with you all today to share more about these really exciting things that we've been seeing, but as well to keep in mind all of the unfortunate attacks that we're seeing. And so with that, thank you again for the opportunity to be here.
Thanks, Luis. Catherine, you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself and the work you do?
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you all for having me here today. Like Colin mentioned, I have a background in LGBTQ rights and also health policy, but I'm here today in my role as a scholar of law and policy with the new UCLA Law Center on Reproductive Health Law and Policy. And so definitely we'll be able to talk about this kind of pending Dobbs decision and the connection between attacks on reproductive rights and the attacks on the LGBTQ community that we're really seeing across the country right now. I wanted to really quickly introduce the new center since it is fairly new. And while some of you likely know about the work of the Williams Institute, we wanted to give it an opportunity to really introduce this new center. It is an interdisciplinary national academic research center, so a similar model to the Williams Institute, and it is the first of its kind to have a center like this that's focused on reproductive rights on the West Coast. Our goals are to serve as a hub to rethink the landscape of reproductive health law and policy, especially in light of Roe v. Wade being overturned, and also to produce evidence-based data and scholarship to educate key stakeholders and disseminate compelling narratives to advance reproductive justice. Another large part of our goal is to be training tomorrow's reproductive rights and reproductive justice movement leaders and to really engage with the students as Williams Institute does, being at UCLA Law. I did want to highlight, I think that we may have circulated this in advance, but we just published our first research study out of the new center, which is very exciting. We looked at the likely travel patterns of people coming to California for abortion care if Roe v. Wade is overturned, based on the laws already in a number of states that will lead abortion to be banned in 26 states across the country. And so we have estimated that there will be an increase of more than 10,000 people per year coming to California for abortion care. And we are working, especially in LA County, to prepare the state for this influx and to make sure that California remains a reproductive freedom state. And I will talk more about California's efforts later, but I wanted to flag that research. I'll also put it in the chat.
Thanks, Catherine. Let's now get into our discussion portion of the program. And at the end of the program, if we have time, we're going to address some of the questions that you all are sending. So please do include some questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to those after we go through the moderated portion of the program right now. So starting out, let's talk about some current events. We've seen in the news that 2022 has been a record year for state level anti-LGBTQ legislation. Christy, could you tell us about the ways that states currently are limiting or rolling back LGBTQ rights?
Yeah, thanks, Colin, for that. So this is a really alarming trend. And I say trend here very deliberately. You may be hearing about these anti-LGBTQ attacks for the first time this year or over the past few years. But this is part of a larger movement that has been happening now for a long, long time. Whether it's a result of backlash after marriage equality became the law of the land, or as non-discrimination protections began to spread, or whether it's states and individuals feeling empowered to attack LGBT people, as we saw these attacks come from the federal government during the Trump administration, or a combination of all of these things. The reality is that it's affecting real people's lives, and in particular youth. So that's kind of where I wanted to really emphasize what is happening right now is around attacks on transgender youth. So like Colin mentioned, it has been a record year for anti-LGBTQ legislation introduced at the state level. So I think, jump in here, Louise or Catherine, if you have a better count. I think the most recent count I saw was about 330 anti-LGBTQ bills being introduced in states just in the 2022 legislative session. It's not all panic. The vast majority of those laws aren't passing, but they take time and resources to deal with. They take resources away from organizations like the Williams Institute, like the ACLU and Lambda Legal, who could focus their efforts on getting supportive policies in place and instead focus all of our attention and the public's attention on these negative laws. So that's the basic point there. Is obviously this is very problematic, but to talk a little bit more about how these laws work and what they do and what we see actually gaining traction in state legislatures, for those of you who maybe have seen bits and pieces of this, but not really a whole comprehensive picture, is like I mentioned, most of these bills are focused not just on trans people, on trans kids, and which is kind of hard to wrap your mind around, right? We think protecting children or supporting kids, that shouldn't be a partisan issue, but it is here. And of course, we see that in other contexts as well. But the way it's playing out here is around certain types of bills that essentially limit trans kids' ability to be themselves in different spheres of their lives. So to give you some examples of what that looks like, I'm sure many of you have heard about just to go back to the number, I think what I saw was that about half of those 330 bills are focused on trans youth. Digging into kind of the types of laws and policies that we're seeing a number of states introduce bills that prohibit kids from participating in school sports consistent with their gender identity. This is not just college athletics. Some of these bills go all the way down as soon as kids start to participate in sports in grade school, where they're really not in any kind of competitive sport. They're just trying to have fun with their friends and get some exercise. And what we see these bills doing is many of them are focused exclusively on girls' sports. And they say a trans girl cannot compete on or cannot participate on a school sports team that is designated for girls in school. Obviously these bills are very troubling, discriminatory on their face, but also have really severe impacts on the kids who are in these states where the legislation is introduced. So I just want to put a pin in that so we can come back to it later. And another attack that we see gaining traction in the states is these bills that limit the provision of gender affirming care for youth. And this is not just transition care like surgery or hormones. This is even medication like puberty blockers that can just be given as kids kind of develop and mature. And it's reversible and they can make other decisions down the line. But these bills really seek to prohibit any kind of care that would allow these kids to live in their true gender identity. I think it's about 18 states that have these athlete or school sports bans in place. Fewer states, about 4 now, have passed these gender affirming care bans, but they are increasing in number. Almost all of those laws that have passed within the past 2 legislative sessions. So again, something that is picking up speed. The kind of final point that I want to make around these, bringing it back to what I said earlier, is that we're hearing a lot about these bills. There are an increasing number kind of being considered and passed, but this is not a new issue. A lot of this is growing out of, for those of you who remember, the efforts in many states to restrict bathroom access for transgender people. So very famously, North Carolina passed a bill referred to as HB2, that was the bill number, back in 2016, and it essentially prohibited trans people from using public restrooms that aligned with their gender identity. Those bills kind of took off and then stopped pretty quickly. We saw advocates be able to really suppress efforts to pass more bills like that. But that doesn't mean these efforts have stopped, right? It's just pivoted and now become more focused on these other issues facing trans youth. So it's a scary time for these kids. Like I mentioned, there are really serious ways that these bills can impact kids, even if they don't pass. There's research out there showing that just the debates around these bills, having kids talk about this in school, having their parents' friends bring it up, seeing it on social media, no matter how their parents or friends are aligned on these issues or not, just being the part of that debate and having your rights being talked about and in the spotlight like that can be harmful for kids, whether or not the bills pass. So pretty devastating effects.
Yeah, so Christy, what's up next then in terms of these state level anti-LGBTQ legislation efforts? I mean, we talked a bit about these trans efforts right now. What do you see around the corner as kind of the next steps that will probably be taken by these individuals?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this will continue just because we have seen success. These bills have success so far in state legislatures. So I think they will continue to find ways to limit rights of students. We also saw in Florida, of course, the bill that got a lot of attention this year was the Don't Say Gay bill that restricted discussion of sexual orientation and gender identity in schools. So, I think that bill got a lot of attention. It sat issue is not new. There are many similar bills that kind of didn't get the same attention, some of which are years old now. But I think that we will see states continue to pass those bills. And I just, we'll talk a little bit later, I think, about kind of the implications of the Dobbs decision and how federal policy shifts will affect these rights. But I just don't see this going away. I mean, we're dealing with a scenario here now where we have protections under Bostock and protections, advancing at the federal level, and states have not backed away from passing these laws. I don't think the threat of a lawsuit will stop them. I don't know if the threat of a loss of federal funding will, but I just don't see this trend, at least in the states that are supportive of these hostile bills, changing course anytime soon.
Yeah. What efforts have you seen that have been most successful to push back against these state level anti-LGBTQ legislation efforts? What's worked so far?
Yeah, so that's a great point. So, like I said, we're seeing a ton of these bills introduced. We have many more on the books than would be ideal, of course, would be zero. So some of them are passing, most of them are not. And I think that's a result of a lot of different efforts among lawyers and advocates, among the public, the media, researchers like us, again, really devoting our resources to pushing back against these bad laws. There are some strategies that have been particularly effective. Unfortunately, having kids talk about their own lives is very effective, but there's a trade-off there. You're putting kids in the spotlight. You're opening them up for attacks. There are legislators on record saying awful things to trans kids who just want to come in and say, I want to play soccer with my friends. And another effective strategy is their parents coming in to talk about how this is affecting their families. And maybe they're thinking about moving out of state because they have to go somewhere where their child can participate in school as themselves. Another particularly effective strategy has been litigation. Of course, problematic that we have to get to this point where so many resources have to go into a very expensive process around beating these laws back. But several of these bills have been challenged, and they are faring, the plaintiffs here are faring pretty well in court. There are examples of courts striking down both athlete bans and these gender affirming care bans as unconstitutional. So I think that trend will also continue. The legal groups are gaining a lot of ground here, and I think that they will continue to fight. I also think we'll see challenges to some of these other types of anti-LGBTQ legislation that are coming up, like the Don't Say Gay bills and stuff like that in the coming years.
Let's now switch a bit to the federal level. At the same time, we've seen the state level anti-LGBTQ legislation. We've heard that President Biden's administration is the most supportive of LGBTQ people in history. Just last week, the president issued an executive order that was focused on LGBTQ rights for Pride Month. Luis, if you could tell us a bit about what that executive order does, and then we can go on from there.
Yes, of course, Colin. Thank you. So like you said, last week, President Biden issued a very sweeping executive order with a number of initiatives that are attempting to protect and support LGBTQ people, and in particular, really support LGBTQ youth and families, although I would highlight that that isn't all that this executive order does. Now, I led by saying that it's really sweeping because I don't think that while we have seen a couple of executive orders come from President Biden that are specific to LGBTQ people, we haven't seen one that's trying to address so many specific issues quite like this one before. And so what's really interesting about it is that it's both attempting to meet the moment that we're in right now. Like Christy described, we're facing so many attacks against LGBTQ youth in particular at the legislative level across the states that this executive order says, well, we need to be able to address that in whatever way the federal government can. And so it's both got elements related to those attacks, but also very uniquely looking at some of the disparities that we know exist in areas like foster care, in areas like the homeless youth population, in juvenile detention. It's making sure that attention and resources are being put in those areas as well to really ensure a whole of government response to a range of issues that are affecting LGBTQ people. And so I'll quickly take us through what some of those issues are just to get a better understanding of what this order is attempting to do. Like I said, it is a very broad, sweeping order, plenty of language there, and a lot for hopefully these agencies to really chew on in the coming months and to really try to engage in further action for these families, and in particular youth. And so starting there with youth, two of, I'd say, some of the chief directives coming out of this executive order are to the Departments of Health and Human Services and the Department of Education to start looking respectively at these attacks we've been seeing against access to gender-affirming care, and then anything ranging from restricting students' participation in sports to policies that might restrict their access of certain facilities, to these Don't Say Gay bills and other issues like that that are affecting them in schools. So this directive is asking that HHS and the Department of Education go and look at what existing authorities would allow them to do with respect to all of these states and schools that might be attempting to restrict LGBTQ rights and put a stop to that. Again, according to whatever power these agencies might have. But in addition to that, it also asks them to look into promulgating new sample policies within the next 200 days so that schools and states that want to be supportive of LGBTQ youth can actually start being proactive about better increasing access to affirming care, of access to affirming schools and things of that nature. And in particular, there's a call for the Department of Health and Human Services to start doing some work on how it might be able to expand access to gender-affirming care itself. Now, in addition to these efforts, the executive order is also directing HHS to lead initiatives in a number of different areas. And these include conversion therapy, looking at state child welfare agencies and mental health issues more broadly, looking at reproductive health care, HIV prevention care. I mentioned earlier housing and homelessness prevention, and to really ensure that the government is putting every resource that it can to provide LGBT competent and specific services. And so it includes in this order a request that agencies start looking into creating targeted funding streams that would create these programs specifically for LGBTQ youth. And it even asks that HHS now look into whether it has the ability to issue guidance that would effectively prohibit the use of federal funding for conversion therapy on youth. And so again, this is an order that it provides a lot of promise for us. And now only time will continue to tell where agencies are going to continue to act on these mandates. Because in addition to all of these programs, the executive order is trying to also set us up on a good foundation for future work. And so, as we've mentioned before, part of the central aim of the Williams Institute is to ensure that research and facts are informing law and policy debates rather than myths and stereotypes. And so what this executive order is seeking to do is actually invest and increase the federal government's investment in the collection of data on sexual orientation and gender identity, and to ensure that agencies that are engaging in that collection are doing so consistent with existing best practices, consistent with the research that we've already been doing on how you can engage in those activities, and to create and continue asking for more money to ensure that we're only continuing that research, to ensure that these efforts only continue to get better and better over time, and to again ensure that all sorts of federal programs are really going to be mindful of LGBTQ people, including, of course, a call for them to consider non-discrimination protections. And of course, I mentioned earlier, a final component that I'd love to highlight is the fact that while this order really tries to focus a lot of energy and attention on LGBTQ youth and their families, given the attacks that they're facing right now, it also includes language asking the Department of Health and Human Services to devote attention to LGBTQ older adults, to ensure that resources, research, and attention are being put towards various, different LGBTQ subpopulations that we often have seen aren't being properly served by some of these programs and services, that aren't receiving all of the care and attention that they need, to really make sure that more and more is being done. And so hopefully over time, we're going to continue to see how these agencies really roll with this language.
Yeah. So what do you see coming up next then in terms of what the administration likely will do as a follow-up to this executive order?
So something I think it's important to keep in mind is that, of course, we've got the White House and the Biden administration working with their policy priorities, but they also, when they're giving these mandates to agencies, the agencies themselves are going off and engaging in their own work, trying to advance these policy agendas. And so we've actually had it on our radar for the last few months that the Department of Education and the Department of Health and Human Services are looking into revising their existing regulations, both for Title IX and then 1557, which would be in healthcare regarding discrimination, to ensure that those have been fully updated to implement, the Supreme Court's decision on Bostock to expressly prohibit sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination. And so I would think that we'll certainly see these agencies issue these rules and then start looking into what those rules and what their existing authority would allow them to do with respect to actually actively addressing some of these state attacks and some of these bans, and to really complement, like Christy mentioned, some of the litigation that advocates are engaging in to try to stop these laws before they can continue to have a negative impact on LGBTQ youth and families. And that, I think, is the other area where I would expect to see a lot of activity from the federal government, is really trying to work with the research that we have and the research that hopefully they're going to start really generating for us in the near future to ensure that their programs are more equitable. So over the last year and a half, the entirety of the Biden administration has been engaged in this effort to really look at every existing program and regulation that they've got and make sure that they incorporate an equitable whole of government, no one is left behind or excluded approach, and expressly including LGBTQ people in that. And so in that time, we've already seen a number of agencies implementing express non-discrimination protections, adding sexual orientation and gender identity measures to their existing surveys, trying to invest more in research. And so I'm hopeful that we're going to just continue to see that kind of activity as they only continue to build on both the research base, but also these legal authorities that are going to allow them to really go in and try to engage in that activity.
Is there anything in the works at the legislative level? We've all heard about how difficult it is to get anything passed through Congress, of course. Is there anything percolating in Congress that you think might have some sort of success over the next several years?
Yeah, certainly. So there's always a number of different acts that are relevant to LGBTQ people. I'd be remiss if I didn't quickly highlight the fact that we did have a fairly recent legislative victory in the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act that actually includes express language that's inclusive of LGBTQ people. And so hopefully that has already been helping to provide much needed resources to, very vulnerable subpopulations of our community. But on top of that, yes, I do think that there are a number of bills that are being considered that certainly seem viable. I think a big one right now on our radar is the Lgbtqi Inclusion Act, which would seek to create, congressional mandate to really make sure that these agencies are doing more in terms of not only doing the research to find out how we can include LGBTQ people in all sorts of surveys and other data collections, but also to make sure that the funding is actually there to engage in that work, to ensure that a consistent mandate is there. Always big targets of the movement and of LGBTQ people have been to ensure that we're counted on things like the decennial census, like the American Community Survey. And that act would really be a big step forward in pushing for that. And so I think that's a big one to keep on the radars that certainly has a lot of interest right now. But on top of that, there's, of course, the Equality Act, which, while it certainly has been pending for quite some time now, is something that I think a lot of eyes remain on, because if it were to be enacted, it's going to take a lot of these debates and just settle them once and for all. I would say the Supreme Court's decision in Bostock made it clear for a large number of our civil rights laws at the federal level that sexual orientation and gender identity are included. But the Equality Act would really make strides in making that concrete, and then hopefully also providing a base to continue to fight back against some of these state attacks that I think a lot of us would argue are violating some of these guarantees against discrimination in a variety of places. And so hopefully we're going to see movement on these and other bills in the coming months.
That's all good to know. So let's turn back now again a bit to the state level. We spoke about some issues at the state level and state level anti-LGBTQ legislation before, but Christy, if you could tell us a little bit about any progress that's currently being made at the state level. For example, are any states adopting LGBTQ supportive laws and policies? We'd love to hear about those.
Yeah, definitely. So, the interesting thing here is that, yes, states are still doing good and supportive things. We just don't hear about it as often as the hostile legislation that we're seeing across probably many more states. I would say for every 10 media interview requests I get to talk about anti-trans legislation or attacks on LGBTQ people, I get one focused on a positive law. That probably reflects a balance of the bills, but it's also kind of means that we're obscuring or just maybe glossing over a lot of the good and progressive things that are happening in terms of LGBTQ rights at the state level. I mean, Louise pointed out so many great things that are happening at the federal level. I know there were so many media articles out there about that executive order. So that is definitely getting attention, but I think we don't focus on the positive things in the states as much. Some of that might be a result of, what we're seeing a lot of here is, and this is a generalization, but we're seeing the good states getting better and we're seeing the bad states getting worse, so it might not be that interesting that California is out here passing another LGBTQ supportive bill. And so we don't hear as much about that. But I think what's happening is there's this media narrative around all these bad things happening, maybe not as many good things, but some effects of that too, I think we're seeing is just this increase in polarization, right? So we're seeing the bad states with the hostile legislation and the good states going even further to protect LGBTQ people. That said, it's still really important. And these laws, even if they're only passing in a few already supportive states, do provide a great model for other states to adopt going forward. And which does happen, for example, Virginia, when the state legislature shifted there a few years ago, all of a sudden they were picking up all of these supportive bills that we'd already seen, making their way across the traditionally more democratic states. So anyway, to just kind of focus on a few of the different policies, and I see that there was a question about gay and trans panic defense bans, so I can address that too, is we're seeing movement in a couple of key areas. One is around conversion therapy bans. So these are laws that prohibit healthcare providers from practicing conversion therapy on LGBTQ youth. These laws are kind of fairly new. They've been around for less than a decade now, but I think at this point we see about 15 states with conversion therapy bans on the books, and that includes legislative bans and some executive action to limit the practice of conversion therapy. So this is definitely, again, an issue that has taken off within the last few years. I think almost all of those bills have passed just within the last 5 years. We're also seeing more states move to banning the gay and trans panic defenses through legislation, which I know the question is about. So for anyone who's not familiar with these, it's kind of an obscure issue, again, that hasn't gotten much attention until recently. But these are statutes that prohibit defendants in criminal cases from arguing that they were provoked by a victim's sexual orientation or gender identity in a way that would support a mitigation from a murder charge to a manslaughter charge. It's shocking, but these defenses have been successful in many cases around the country for decades. They rest on these assumptions that being LGBTQ is inherently dangerous and abnormal, and people can react to LGBTQ people with violence and are less culpable than if they took the same action against a non-LGBTQ person. So and if you think, I think the Matthew Shepard case is kind of an example of where this defense was raised. In that case, the judge said, we don't recognize that defense here too. So that has happened in states before, but we're really seeing a trend towards the legislature stepping in, which of course makes a difference because that means in every court across the state, the defendants can't raise these defenses any longer. And it's not going to be left to an individual judge or court to decide that, or a jury to accept or reject the argument. And I see the second part of the question is, how does barring the defenses affect LGBTQ people? So, of course, this is not going to stop crime against LGBTQ people from happening. It probably won't even go that far in curbing the epidemic of violence, particularly against Black trans women who are murdered at an alarming rate in this country. But the laws are really important in that they send the message that the state is not going to condone violence against LGBTQ people. And they support other initiatives like hate crime laws and similar, even non-discrimination laws, any laws out there to protect LGBTQ people and say an LGBTQ life is not worth less. So I think they're very important for that reason. It's a good way for a state to come out and say, again, something that many people already think should be wrong or is wrong, but for a state to really back that up and not leave it in the hands of individual judges or jurors. So another area where we've seen some progress lately is around non-discrimination laws. And this is kind of interesting because the most movement lately is not among the states that are generally the most supportive of LGBTQ people, because this is kind of a foundational protection that has been around in the supportive states for decades, going back all the way to the early 80s when Wisconsin became the first state to pass a law protecting people from discrimination based on sexual orientation and employment. But what's happening now is, and this is kind of where I was saying I was generalizing before about the good states getting better and the bad states getting worse, is we're actually seeing the most movement in terms of non-discrimination laws at the administrative agency level in states. So this is actually where human rights commissions and departments who are in charge of enforcing state non-discrimination laws are stepping in and saying, well, we have a non-discrimination law that looks just like Title VII. We heard from the Supreme Court that under Title VII, you can't discriminate based on sexual orientation or gender identity. We consistently interpret our law like courts interpret Title VII. So we're going to say that we're now interpreting our state's non-discrimination law to bar discrimination against LGBTQ people. And this is happening in states like Kansas, North Dakota, Michigan, Pennsylvania, even Florida, where we see hostile bills being passed at the same time. So I think this is one key area and kind of brings it back to Luis's point that even where a legislature is not necessarily willing to act, there are other avenues for policy progress through executive branch agencies.
Let's turn next to the Dobbs decision, the Dobbs abortion case that's currently pending before the Supreme Court and will likely have the decision come out within the next few weeks. Catherine, could you talk to us a bit about first what the case is about, and then we can do some follow-up tying together its implications to the LGBTQ movement after that.
Yes, absolutely. So the Dobbs case is Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health, which is an abortion clinic in Mississippi. And it involves a 15-week ban on abortions that was passed by Mississippi a number of years ago. I think what's important to note is that a 15-week ban very explicitly violates the existing case law that we have under Roe and Casey. And so from the very beginning of this case moving, we have seen and recognized that this is going to be a test case to try to overturn Roe. The Supreme Court heard oral arguments in this case last December. And as you mentioned, we are waiting for the final decision. The Supreme Court is in the process of releasing the last of their opinions for this session. And so I think we can expect to see that final decision in the Dobbs case sometime in the next week or two. That being said, this is a very unique situation in that we sort of have an idea of what that decision will look like because we have a leaked draft majority opinion. And so as many of you may have seen in the first week of May, a draft of that decision was leaked to Politico and published. And so we've all had a chance to look at it and kind of see what potential implications could come out of this case. The leaked draft was an explicit overturning of Roe and Casey. Before we saw that draft, there was a possibility that the court could have done some judicial gymnastics and uphold the 15-week ban that they were asked to review, but not specifically overturn Roe. Although, as I mentioned, that would really kind of be some creative arguing because the law does violate the existing standards that we have. And so the leaked draft shows that there is some will on the court to explicitly overturn Roe and Casey. The draft said that there is no federal right to an abortion protected by the federal Constitution, and talks a little bit about the underlying legal principles that Roe was based on, and sort of suggests that some of those things are not as strongly supported by the court as well. I keep mentioning that it is a draft because I think it's important to recognize that the final decision could potentially look a little bit different. I don't think that it is very likely that we're going to get out of the end of the month with Roe v. Wade still as intact precedent. The fact that Alito was assigned to write the majority draft shows that there were at least 5 votes among the Supreme Court justices to at the very least uphold that 15-week ban. And I think it's very likely that the final decision will look a lot like this draft that we have seen. But some of the citations and references and reasoning that I'm going to talk about that could potentially implicate LGBTQ rights might not necessarily be in the final decision. So I just want to note that.
So talk to us then, if this decision comes out and looks roughly like it did in its draft, what's going to be the immediate impact of it?
So the immediate impact is that there will be 26 states. So the immediate impact will be that the question of whether or not abortion is legal will be returned to the states. There will no longer be a federal constitutional protection, and it'll go to a pre-Roe landscape, which is when states were allowed to decide for themselves whether they allowed abortion and if they wanted to ban it. And it potentially, if you have a full overturning of Roe rather than some sort of in-between thing, which is what I think we expect, that means that states could choose to ban abortion completely. And based on either laws that are already on the books, there's a number of things called trigger bans that states have passed anytime since Roe was decided almost 50 years ago till now, that will go into effect, that will be triggered by Roe being overturned. And so there are a number of states that already have bans on their books that they just need Roe to be overturned. And then sometimes that needs to be certified by the state government, or they have passed laws since we've seen this leaked opinion, or just have other laws that have not currently been in effect. There's a number of pre-Roe bans that people just never took out of the state laws. So because of that, there are 26 states that are certain or likely to ban abortion after this final decision comes down, which will leave, millions of people without the ability to access this really basic form of healthcare. And that'll be sort of the immediate effect. Then there's also some language in the draft opinion that could potentially open up some other fundamental rights to either legal challenges or just more restrictive laws being passed in states that want to lean into this ideology that the Supreme Court is opening up, is kind of showing that they're more favorable towards. And so I can kind of dive into that if that makes sense. Yeah.
Tell us about how Dobbs ultimately will implicate LGBTQ rights with all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned that the leaked opinion says that there is no federal right to an abortion. They say that Justice Alito says that, saying that there is, no mention of abortion in the Constitution. And he also says, while he's kind of suggesting that that's why Roe was incorrectly decided, he says there's also not an explicit mention of the right to privacy. And he adopts in other parts of the opinion these originalist interpretations of the Constitution, looking at, what was in the actual text of the document, and also what did people think that meant at the time that the Constitution or the 14th Amendment went into effect. And he's interpreting what constitutional rights are protected based on that reasoning. And so by both kind of questioning the validity of a right to privacy, and then also taking this interpretation of, what did folks think was a right in the 1860s, he kind of points at a number of other fundamental rights that could potentially be challenged under the same reasoning. The right to privacy originally came out of Griswold v. Connecticut, which was the case that said that you couldn't prevent married couples from using birth control, and it was later expanded to single people as well. And so that's one that I think is like very clearly in the crosshairs of this opinion. And then there's a lot of the LGBTQ rights opinions that are reliant on similar reasoning. In a lot of the landmark LGBTQ rights decisions, you see citations to Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, and the ideas of privacy and dignity and substantive due process, and these ability to make personal decisions for yourself and your family in your intimate relationships. The case law is all really looped together. And so this is potentially very damaging. Some of the rights include, I mentioned contraception, Lawrence v. Texas, which was the Supreme Court case that said a state could not prohibit same-sex intimate conduct, is also rooted in these same bases. Same with an older case about being free from government sterilization. And then also the marriage cases, both same-sex marriage and interracial marriage, rely on some of these similar principles. And so the effect won't be immediate. It won't be that, you know, Roe gets struck down, and so now like an existing ban on marriage is automatically in effect. But it kind of shows the playbook that folks who might want to strike down those bans or strike down those rights could use. And the reasoning that is underlying this decision would support an outcome of getting rid of other rights as well.
Which of those precedents do you think is in the most immediate crosshairs of people who would be opposing the precedents once this Dobbs decision comes out?
So I think first of all, that I think is kind of probably the most likely to be weakened immediately is birth control access. And part of that is because it's, you know, a very clear line from Griswold and the right to privacy to the language in this decision, kind of, you know, disparaging the right to privacy. And also because we have seen a lot of legislators, particularly now emboldened by this draft leaked opinion, trying to pass really restrictive abortion laws that often don't comport with sort of medical information about how pregnancy happens. And so a classic example that I've been pointing to, which I don't think actually succeeded going through the legislature, but the state of Louisiana introduced a complete abortion ban that would have defined a person under the murder statute as a fertilized egg. A fertilized egg is not actually a pregnancy, according to OBGYNs. It needs to be implanted into the uterus. And there are a number of forms of birth control that prevent that implantation. And so because we have really emboldened anti-choice legislators and a lack of medical information going behind these laws, there are already some efforts that may or may not be specifically targeting birth control that could make certain forms of birth control difficult to access or illegal. And then I think less so, you know, a conscious effort necessarily, but more just something that is dangerous is there are a number of states, like I mentioned, that have never taken their anti-sodomy law out of their state constitution or never changed the constitution to recognize marriage between people of the same sex. And so those states like that, where they might have some of those laws still in effect, could try to start enforcing them. It wouldn't require as much, you know, political will to pass something like that through the legislature or launch a lawsuit in the courts. There are some of these things that are still in effect, and they could try to use that same reasoning if they get challenged in the courts.
Okay. Follow-up question to that, and it looks like we only have about 5 minutes left, unfortunately, but tell us about how progressive and inclusive states can support LGBTQ people and also people seeking abortions who are from other states amidst all of this.
Yeah, so we've seen a number of states, you know, as we've seen states using this draft opinion or just the Supreme Court hearing this case to pass anti-abortion bills. We've also seen progressive states doing the opposite and really trying to pass legislation that will protect and expand access to abortion. And that's happening, I can talk especially about in California, but I know that there are also bills that have been moving and even enacted in Connecticut and New York and other places as well. One large category of bills that California is that are currently working their way through the state legislature in California are legal protections against the kind of vigilante laws that we are seeing in places like Texas and Oklahoma that would allow lawsuits against people who help people get abortions. California has a number of bills protecting medical providers and people who help people get abortions from civil liability or criminal liability, saying that the state courts in California will not enforce subpoenas or enforce these, criminal bans or efforts to sue people for providing abortions, and also strengthening the privacy laws around health information, in particular for private, for things that are considered these, medical procedures that could potentially be targeted. And I will mention there is a piece of legislation that's sort of a similar model that is going through the California state legislature around gender affirming care, protecting medical privacy records of people who might be coming to California for gender affirming care, and prohibiting law enforcement from arresting people for a different state's law if they are trying to criminalize that kind of care. So it's a model that can kind of apply for both. And then California is also just doing, working on a lot of bills to kind of bolster the workforce for abortion providers, expand training opportunities and funding, make it so that nurse practitioners can more easily provide abortions without physician supervision, and particularly really trying to fund programs that are training providers who are going to serve people who live in places that are historically underserved. So trying to address existing health disparities in the state while we kind of bolster up that workforce.
Thank you so much. And I think we are about out of time right now, but thanks so much for joining us, Catherine and Christy and Luis. This was a really interesting discussion. I just want to thank as well everybody who joined us as attendees today. I'm glad we were able to do this for Pride Month, and I'm so glad that the Williams Institute was able to take its time to come and speak with us. So thank you again, and happy Pride Month, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you all so much.